What is good, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This week another exciting deck profile for Divine Set 1. This will be the second deck we cover from that set, but it will be a very specific one because it's one of the decks that did not really get support this set, but got supported by a promo and one of the generic cards we received in the set. And that deck we're going to talk about is Mythiarq. And this is probably an unlikely deck for many people to be excited about, but I really like this deck and I like what it can do, and so I think it's really cool to show it off. So let's go over the right line first and then I can explain the main deck, because I feel like most people will not know these cards yet. So very important, we run the Mythiarq starter. It's an important piece because it has the Mythiarq name, and we'll go over that part later, but you can also just run anything else in this slot. But the grade 0 does have its use because you can return it to the hand from drop. You then have the grade 1, Illandrina. He's probably the most important combo piece in the entire deck, simply because of his second effect. In the back row, when your other unit with Mythiarq in its card name is placed by a unit's ability, and your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you can choose one card in the same column and give it plus 5k. Well, you choose your front row specifically, but yeah, it gets plus 5k, and this effect is not once per turn, so whenever it happens, you can give the 5k again. And so this makes Illandrina very strong, and one of the cards you really have to look out for in the matchup. Your opponent will always try to retire this if they know what his effect is, so he's a very important piece. And the nice thing about it, when he's rode upon by the grade 2, he calls himself to the back row. Well, he can call himself to the front row as well if you're going first to just pressure, but generally you're going to call him to the back row, keep him safe, and have him ready for your turn 3. We then have Ludomanto, the grade 2 from the right line. You have to run him obviously to be able to call Illandrina out. He is a bit less strong, but he still has the same effect where if he's rode upon by the next one, he calls himself out, which is important for our grade 3. And then when this one is placed on rearguard and you have 3 or more units with Mythiarq, you may soul charge. You kind of want to soul charge because you use up a lot of soul, but it's kind of dependent on the situation in the hand. Like generally you want the soul if you're going to do a lot of restands, so yeah. The extra soul charge is nice, but it's not always mandatory. And then you can choose one of your opponent's rear guards that cannot intercept until end of turn, which isn't that great against most decks, but some decks, if they have strong intercepts that they revive, this could be good. But this is the only copy I run of the card, so unless you return him with your restander, which we'll go over later, you kind of just don't use this one besides that first time you get to call him out of the soul. So yeah, that's it for the right line, and then we get into the big boss monster, and probably the reason why the Mythiarq deck has a chance at surviving in any future environment if it gets good support. So Lurid Soul has an insane effect. So when she's placed on Vanguard Circle, we look at top 7 and we choose a card with grade 3 or less from among them and we call it to rear. And then if you have 5 units, your opponent chooses a card from their hand and they discard it. And this requirement of 5 units counts your Vanguard as well. And so this is pretty strong because your right line gets called out, so you already have 2 bodies on the field. You then call one with this effect, so that's 4 bodies on the field. So as long as you commit a single card to the field and it stays there, you're pretty much safe. And so this is a really cool way to just snipe an extra card out of your opponent's hand. The other effect that's important is when you attack a Vanguard, you can counterblast one, choose a Mythiarq rearguard, return it to hand, and then choose another Mythiarq card with a different card name and call it from hand. This allows you to do a multi-attack immediately, which is 4 attacks, which is really nice, and that obviously triggers Illandrina's effect, so the thing that gets called is actually immediately pretty strong. So yeah, the right line itself is really good, and it's part of the reason I think I kind of like this deck, because it's such a generically good effect, but it's obviously locked to the Mythiarq engine and it wants you to run Mythiarq cards, and that's kind of where the deck fell apart before. Luckily, with a new promo, they kind of got streamlined in this very cool direction where they have a restander. So let's put these aside, don't have to put them away yet. And let's go over the grade 3s first. So we're running 3 copies of our Persona Rite, which is obviously one of the most important cards in the deck, because every time this card is ridden, you get to check top 7 for a card, and this gives you a lot of consistency in doing the things you want to do. If your opponent retired your entire field, this can be the difference between not really playing the game anymore or just being able to get back, because getting any card from top 7 is kind of impressive, right, as an effect. So I really like the way this card is designed. We then have another grade 3, which is Alperal. And we run this one at 4, kind of like all of the Mythiarq cards. We're forced to run them at 4 because we otherwise don't have enough copies. And this one says, when he's placed, if you have 3 or more units with Mythiarq in their card name, which is a generic text every single one of them has, which includes your Vanguard. So as long as you have your Vanguard and one other rearguard on the field, this thing gets plus 5k, and you're then able to pay a counterblast to draw a card. This is generally the card you want to call first and then swing with, or call with your Mythiarq Vanguard effect to then call mid-battle phase and be an 18k attacker, 28 on Persona Ride. So he makes really good numbers, and he gives you draw power and an outlet for your counterblast, because generally this deck does not counterblast all that much, and it has room to countercharge. Besides this counterblast, you have the counterblast from your Vanguard's multi-attack, so 2 on a turn, and then the ability to countercharge is there, so it's not that bad actually counterblast-wise. So that's it for the grade 3s. If we ever get a better grade 3, we might just cut this down a few copies, but right now it's one of the best things to multi-attack with this skill. So that's why we still run it at 4. Then go into the grade 2s, and the grade 2s are quite a lot of cards. Let's put them all down and then go over them one by one. So the first one, and probably the whole reason this deck is even playable, is Delina. So she is the new card we received. It's a promo. It released alongside the Vine Set 1, I believe. That's why we only have it available now. And it has a really cool effect. At the end of the battle, your Vanguard with Mythiarq in its card name attack the grade 3 or greater unit, Soul Blast 1, stand this unit, and it gets plus 10k. So this is a really strong multi-attacker on your turn 4, or if you go in second, on your turn 3, because it's immediately 20k, and if the Ilondrina is behind it, it becomes 25, so you can get a lot of good value out of this and swing for good numbers twice. Its second effect is also really interesting because that helps in the retire matchup. So at the end of the battle, if you have 3 or more units, at the end of your turn, if you have 3 or more units with Mythiarq in the card name, you can retire it and choose a card from drop with Mythiarq in its card name, different from her name sadly, because otherwise she could just bounce herself, which would have been much cooler, but yeah. You can pick one and add it to your hand, and this is the reason why you kind of want to run the starter, because if you Soul Blast it out, you can still add it to your hand, and obviously that's the only card in your soul that's gonna be a Mythiarq that you can Soul Blast, because the other 2 will be on your field most likely. So for that reason, you kind of want to run the starter because you have a way to add it back to your hand, and then you have 5k extra shield, which is really cool. But that's only good in retire matchups, because otherwise you kind of want to keep her on the field. If they swing into her, she kind of worked as 5k shield anyway, so that makes her probably more valuable because most opponents will be swinging for higher numbers. So it's kind of a choice you have to make during the game, but generally you're going to retire her to get a piece back and try to set up for next turn again. So yeah, she's amazing. She's the reason I like this deck, and the only restriction being that your opponent needs to be at grade 3 is a rough one. Because before, when I tested the deck out on online simulators, we actually got a mistranslation where it just said if your Vanguard attacks, if your grade 3 Mythiarq Vanguard attacks, she can restand. And so I just did 5 attacks on turn 3 while my opponent was grade 2, and the deck just felt like the most broken thing ever. And sadly that's just not the case. It's restricted to your opponent being grade 3, so you kind of want to go second now, just get the extra draw and be able to pressure immediately. And otherwise, if you go first, you just hold these in hand and wait for the perfect opportunity to drop 2 on your Persona Ride and just put in a lot of pressure. So yeah, the card is balanced and that's nice about it. We then obviously run the new Energy Cycler grade 2. These cards are amazing, and in a deck like Mythiarq where you just need all of your pieces, this is really strong. And since we're so Persona Ride dependent anyway, the secondary effect is actually really good. So sometimes I just keep a copy of this on my hand to call it when I'm Persona Riding to get a copy of my Restander back to my hand, because this is the only way we can recycle grade 2s from drop. And so yeah, this is a really important effect, but otherwise we can always just discard it during write-up to get draws and draw that way into pieces that give us consistency. So this card is really important for this deck, and it helps it in so many ways, so that's why we had to wait till the set to really record this video. So yeah, for those who don't know, you have the choice between Counter Blast and Energy Blast. 99% of the time you're going to go for the Energy Blast, but on that Persona Ride turn, if you ran out of energy for some reason, you can always just Counter Blast also for that effect, because generally you'll have enough Counter Blast to work with. So we run this at 4. it's sadly still an expensive card, but if you're playing Mythiarq, it's kind of hard to just not use the best generic pieces we can find. So this card is really, really good in this deck, because it needs the extra plussing. Right, another Mythiarq card. This is Mythiarq. Mythiarq is also really interesting because he also gets plus 5k when you have 3 or more units with Mythiarq in his card name. We can announce Soul Blast 1, choose an opponent's rear guard, and that unit cannot stand during your opponent's next stand phase. So this effect may sound like mediocre at first, but against some decks it can be quite good, and it's mainly good if we also combine it with the right line grade too. So if you're capable of using both of these effects, you kind of get the mega colony lock thing going, where your opponent cannot stand and also cannot intercept, and so the piece is locked on the board and they have to find another way to just get rid of it from the board. And so generally this is a good combination to have on your first grade 3 turn. If your opponent trusts you already, then you can lock something down, and because this soul charges, this soul blast, they kind of synergize in that way as well. There's also a second thing about this effect. If you have a grade 3 Mythiarq Vanguard, you have an X skill to bind a rearguard with a different card name and then call it again. So this is kind of a Bermuda-like effect where you bounce something and call it again, which is also really cool because it triggers Illandrina's effect for the back row effect to give it plus 5k. So he's really cool, and he synergizes well with the right line and also with the grade 3 that gives you the draw. So that's also a way just to get a lot of CP used up when you take a lot of damage and draw a lot of cards. So Mythiarq, he is like the combo enabler, I suppose, and is a way to get a lot of extra value out of it. And being able to stun things is nice, because if your opponent has a full field, you could also just use it twice to get both intercepts locked. So it's a cool card. It's only 15k, but it's good as a first swing, and then bounce and call something else. So that's it for the grade 2s. We then go into the grade 1s, and for grade 1s, we do still have quite a lot of slots. So let's spread them out. You already know this card. We run it once in the right deck and 3 times in the main deck, because it's just the best grade 1 to have in the back row, because it gives power to all of our rear guards in the front row. So having one in both columns is amazing. Having to call a 1 when your opponent retires your field gives you a lot of value again, so this card definitely needs to be at 4. We then also have Uzaster. This rabbit allows us to countercharge when we haven't countercharged yet this turn. So, and we need to have, we have to have 3 face down cards. Yeah, it's been a while since I used this card. So since we are capable of counterblasting quite a lot, this can also be live immediately on our first grade 3 turn, but obviously that's not ideal. But if it has to be, it can be, and it's another Mythiarq name, which is good in consistency. So when going in the early game, it's also nice to just call this one behind your Vanguard, because this is fine behind Vanguard, while Illandrina isn't that great. And so this gives you that extra body you need to get to the 5th piece on your board. So yeah, that's why we run him, because he's Mythiarq, and he's also something we can commit in the early game to have more pressure. Last but not least, we have Mythiarq Habitat. One of the few cards I kind of don't like in this deck, and I feel like just should be cut at some point, but right now it helps in consistency. So the thing about Mythiarq Habitat is it does not really synergize with Illandrina, because he says it needs to be called by a unit's ability, not by a card effect, and that causes it to kind of clash. It's nice though, because if we write our Luritsul and we don't find anything interesting in top 7, but we do find Habitat, we can call Habitat, and Habitat's effect bounces it back to hand. So we'll have an extra top 7 searched and we filtered. If we see this in the early game, this also allows us to get much easier access to our pieces and gives us the consistency to get those 5 pieces on board. But I feel like this is the weakest link in the entire deck, because it does not synergize with Illandrina. So I feel like if you want to run something that just revives or gives you an extra body, I feel like this is the first card to cut. But for right now, I feel like it's one of the good choices, but we'll have to see in the future if any generic piece can just replace this and then make it better. So yeah, that's it for the grade 1s. We then still have our triggers and our PGs. So standard lineup, I don't think I have to explain this. 3 PGs and a Blitz order, just the way to go. And then for triggers, it's also pretty generic. We go with the 8 crits, if I can get them on the board. 8 crits, because we just need the pressure. Any early crit is gonna help us immensely when we finally get to our restander turn, so we really like to see those. We then have 4 heals, which is also obviously the most generic thing in the world. Everybody runs 4 heals. And then we have 1 Stoichea over trigger and 3 front triggers. And so front triggers are really good in this deck because if you do a restander turn, you get a plus 10k on both. And since this calls immediately on attack a new body to the front row, it will benefit from the front trigger. And this allows you to do a lot less clunky multi-attack, I suppose. If you check a front, the thing that's being called is always going to hit over a defensive, so that makes it a lot stronger. And obviously fronts are just really good in the current format because 20k shield helps against many decks. So yeah, that's why I went for this trigger lineup. So basically, that's it for the deck profile part. I'll now go into a little bit of a combo turn and try to show off how a good finisher turn would look for Mythiarq. Alright, so I made a setup that allows us to explain how a good combo turn would look. So let's say we start our turn, we have a couple of cards on hand, including the Persona Rite, which is probably the most important piece, and we draw a card. So we then are capable to Persona Rite, which allows us to get plus 10k to the front row for the turn, which this deck kind of really needs the extra power, so Persona Rite is really important. We then draw from the Persona Rite, and we're then capable of checking top 7 to find pieces. So 3, and 1. And let's see if we find anything interesting, and we're super lucky. We find our Restander, which is a card we did not have at this point of the game. So we're then going to shuffle the deck. It doesn't have to be that great because this is just a test game. We're going to call it, and now because we still have 5 cards on the field, our opponent has to discard 1. And so if they're smart, they're gonna retire our front rows, and we're not gonna be able to get that little combo off, but it's kind of nice if it happens. So because this now is being called by a card effect, Illandrina's effect triggers and gives it plus 5k for the rest of the turn, so that's really good. We then still have another card in our hand, so we can call this one. And since our other card was placed by a card effect, this card also triggers and gives plus 5k here, so that's nice. We still also have this act skill, so sadly we cannot use his effect to give him another plus 5k, but it's kind of fine because this will also just immediately be good. Oh, we did draw into a second copy, so I feel like that's actually a really good thing. Instead of doing it like this, we can also just call this unit, or we can wait and call it with our Vanguard's ability mid-battle. So we'll see what the triggers will bring, because this also already gives us the 5th stack, so we don't really need to do this, but it could be nice during the end phase. Right, so for the attacks, we then would go for 25, 25, we'll go with our Vanguard boosted, and since this only triggers when you have 3 or more face down cards in your damage zone, we'll go first with this effect to counterblast 1, choose one of our Mythiarq units, bounce it to hand, and then call another Mythiarq unit from our hand. And since we're going to countercharge, it's actually really nice to call this one, because this will give us an extra draw. This will be 18, 28, and while this one would be 30, this is probably still fine. So I'll go for this one to get the extra draw, and then we have follow-up for next turn. This counter charges on the boost, and then with this on place effect we counterblast again, give him plus 5k and draw a card. Then Illandrina also just triggered, so he also has plus 5 once again. We then do our twin drive, so first check, second check, we're super lucky, we get the front trigger, so we put another 10k to the front, and then at the end of the battle, the grade 3 Vanguard attacked a grade 3, we can Soul Blast out 1, so we'll Soul Blast out a Persona Rite copy to give her the restand, and if she restands, she gets another plus 10, so we'll put a 10 on there. We can then go with this one, which is 43 plus 8, which is 51, and then this one goes for 25, 45, 53. So as you can see, the numbers get really big, and so they're actually really nice to play around with. And the nice thing now is during the end phase, we can check our hand, and we see we don't have a Persona Rite copy yet, so When Delfina's effect triggers, we can retire her and we can return our Persona right back to our hand and be ready for next turn. And that will give us the consistency to keep putting up pressure. So that's pretty much what Mythiarq can do right now. It may not be the most exciting thing or the most crazy thing, so this is not a deck I would recommend you take to a Springfest, but it's obviously a deck that can perform well at a locals, and I feel like that's where this deck belongs right now. It's fun to take to a locals and probably do well with. Sadly, I haven't been able to take it to a locals myself because Springfest is coming up and I've been testing with other decks that I feel are actually good enough to bring to a PSF, but it's one of the decks I'm excited to bring once PSF is over and just see how well I can do with it. So guys, thank you for watching. If you have any questions or ideas on how to improve this deck, please leave them down below in the comments, and I hope to see you next time.